Welcome to the coast of Limgrave. This lush, expansive region of the lands between is where Elden Ring's closed network test took place, and where between November 12th and November 14th, I spent 15 glorious hours experimenting, exploring, battling, and even quietly reflecting on the natural beauty of this game world. There's so much I could say about my time with the network test. I have a few relatively small gripes, I do, but for the vast majority of my playthrough, I was blown away. My already high expectations were shattered by Hidetaka Miyazaki's ambition, by the wide-ranging combat mechanics, by the inspired enemy designs and clever AI, by the new, rich, intriguing lore, by the way the FromSoft team, in my opinion, successfully integrated a dynamic and engaging open field area with more classic and tightly curated mines, catacombs, and castles. I could ramble for hours about all of this, seriously. But I feel in order to best articulate my thoughts about the network test, everything I learned about the game, what I loved about it, the few things I didn't love about it, instead of giving you some overwhelming chronological play-by-play account of my playthrough, I'm going to share my 13 biggest takeaways. The 13 most important realizations and revelations I had during my time with Elden Ring, all supported by footage I captured during my playthrough. This is not an exhaustive list of every single aspect of the game, but just the elements that interested me or jumped out at me most. And if you're new to my channel, I'd encourage you to go back and watch my previous Elden Ring and From Software content to get a better idea of where I'm coming from. In short, I've been playing Soulsborne games for a decade now, first discovering Dark Souls back in late 2011, and it truly changed my life as much as a video game possibly could. These 6 key titles, from Demon's Souls to Sekiro, are my favorite games of all time. I speedrun these games, I do challenge runs in these games, I casually screw around in these games, and I love all their ingredients, the lore, the music, the art direction, but I'm a very combat-oriented player. For me, nothing is more important than the minute-to-minute gameplay of Miyazaki's games. That's what anchors them and makes them so special, what sets them apart from every other game and franchise out there, at least for me. Now, if you enjoy my channel and enjoy this network test recap, I'm actually sharing a second video, a sequel of sorts to this one, exclusively with my patrons on Patreon. Patreon is not only a great way to support what I do, but to also receive a lot of extra content from me, like my newsletter, my podcast, early video previews, behind the scenes content, and all of my patrons, regardless of tier, will have access to this second video in which I share even more footage and takeaways from my network test playthrough. So you can hop over to patreon.com/Terrapop if you're interested. But for now, let's dive into my 13 biggest takeaways from the time I spent with what might be my single most anticipated video game of all time, the one and only Elden Ring. My first takeaway is that Miyazaki wasn't lying. In terms of feel, Elden Ring truly feels like an amalgamation of every previous Soulsborne game. In June, Miyazaki told IGN, quote, "It's very difficult to summarize briefly what Elden Ring is, but to us, it represents a culmination of all of our know-how, all of our passion across all of these games to deliver a brand new dark fantasy IP." End quote. He also said, quote, "After my 10 years or so of directing games, this really feels like a culmination of everything that I've enjoyed about game development and everything I've brought to this point." End quote. And after 15 hours of having a controller in my hand, Elden Ring live on my TV, yes, I can tell you that Miyazaki wasn't being hyperbolic or just trying to offer up some perfect quote or soundbite. On the surface, it feels like Dark Souls and Sekiro had a baby, but they did so through a surrogate, and that surrogate was Breath of the Wild. And then as the baby grew, it was occasionally babysat by Bloodborne, whose influence really left a positive impression. And then the baby later went to Shadow of the Colossus Daycare, and A Song of Ice and Fire Elementary, and Lord of the Rings High. You get the idea. But what does this mean on a more micro, nitty-gritty level? To me, it means the design of Stormveil Castle, the network test's only legacy or main dungeon, is reminiscent of Boletarian Palace from Demon's Souls, particularly levels 1-1, 1-3, and 1-4. The brilliant enemy placement, the design of the actual pathways and stairwells. It means the world is satisfyingly interconnected like in Dark Souls 1, but on a much grander scale. It means that there's a new system for switching and dual-wielding weapons that feels somewhat rooted in Dark Souls 2's power stancing system. It means there's a particular emphasis or advantage to incorporating charged R2 attacks like in Bloodborne, and there's also underground catacombs that call to mind Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons. It means there's a wealth of fun and powerful and easily interchangeable weapon skills, reminiscent of those in Dark Souls 3. It means there's simple but effective systems for stealth and jumping like in Sekiro, as well as a somewhat more complex stance or posture system that can be broken in a variety of ways, also akin to what we saw in Sekiro. While playing the network test while executing various inputs, Elden Ring felt very familiar while feeling very fresh and unique at the same time. Simply put, if you're genuinely a fan and admirer of Miyazaki's games, you are in for one of the great gaming treats of your lifetime, for real. Takeaway number 2, evasive rolls feel less spammable and more skill-based than in DS3, for example. Evasive dodges are a staple of almost every Miyazaki game, and learning to time your dodges relative to enemy or boss attacks, that's one of the most basic but fun and engaging skill-based learning curves in these games. But what I appreciated in Elden Ring is that roll spamming, even when favoring endurance and dexterity, isn't nearly as reliable. You can't just back roll your way out of every oncoming flurry of attacks. Often when attempting to do so, it felt like my iframes were cut in half, disrupted. It felt like I was actively being punished for playing in a way that's second nature to many Souls players. Margit the Fell Omen, the only mandatory boss in the network test, I'm going to be talking much more about him later, but he even has a ranged attack that feels designed to specifically punish players who attempt to backroll their way out of trouble during the battle. And in general, I noticed this while fighting many enemy types, but it was most evident while fighting Margit. To me, it feels like successful rules are timed and executed slightly later than in past Souls games. On numerous occasions, I felt like I was being punished for my Demon's Souls and Dark Souls muscle memory. Now, I'm not suggesting the timing is wildly different in Elden Ring, but it did feel later to me, more last second. And in my mind, that means it's improved, it's better, it requires even more skill and patience to read attack patterns and really wait for the right moment to strategically hit that roll button, not 5 times in a row, but once or twice in perfect succession. Takeaway number 3, the new jumping mechanic is transformative. Elden Ring platforming is a thing, and I'm all about it. You see some crumbling ruins out in the field, and it's like, I wonder if I can climb my way up there. And lo and behold, you can. And there's a few treats waiting for you, not to mention gorgeous vistas when you get up there. I had hoped this would be the case, that jumping would unlock new and exciting possibilities, and it really does. I found myself so curious while exploring the world, whether in a dungeon or in the open field, more so than ever before because of my new capabilities. In my gameplay showcase breakdowns, I also talked about how From Software has clearly prioritized a fast and responsive jump versus a realistic and elaborately animated one, and I'm glad they did. I always prefer responsiveness over realism, and I know Miyazaki does as well based on his design decisions. Jumping also transforms the combat gameplay. One thing I noticed right away is that the all-new jump attacks do not perfectly track, meaning just because you hop up in the air and mash R1 or R2, that doesn't mean you're going to successfully land a hit. On more than one occasion, I miscalculated a jump attack and entirely vaulted over a mobile mobile enemy, leaving myself open to damage from behind. At the same time, jump attacks are somewhat spammable. They're plain fun to do. While playing as the Enchanted Knight class, I was so tempted to begin every single enemy encounter with a jump attack with my winged spear. Jump attacks feel slightly OP, but again, when fighting small, quick enemies like the Jade Goblins in Limgrave's Catacombs, they become more difficult to successfully execute. But there were a few moments in my playthrough when it felt like I could spam the jump button without incorporating attacks and unfairly evade oncoming enemies, even boss attacks. So I think a little fine-tuning is likely needed when it comes to the iframes associated with jumping and maybe even the somewhat spammable nature of jump attacks, but again, jumping is fun, it feels good, and I think it's going to be one of those new features that we sorely miss when we return to previous Soulsborne games. For example, I've played a little Bloodborne since the network test, and as incredible as Bloodborne is and will always be, I was more aware than ever of the fact that my player character's feet felt somewhat nailed to the ground as I ran through Yharnam and battled enemies and bosses. But in my mind, that's a good sign. We want FromSoft to add new systems and mechanics that we come to feel that we almost can't live without. The double jumping on horseback while riding your Mount Torrent, that's great too. It's such a simple thing, adding that one extra jump, but it opens so many possibilities with platforming and with combat, like successfully vaulting over the flames from a fire-breathing dragon. But I was surprised to realize that the double jump does not necessarily save you from critical fall damage like I assumed it would. Fall damage is significantly nerfed in Elden Ring compared to previous Souls games, and for the most part, it's great. But there were a few times when I died after completing a horse jump that just felt wonky and unfair and inconsistent. I also thought the very beginning of the test, where you wake up in this cool cave called the Fringe Folk Hero's Grave, had an odd moment related to jumping and fall damage. Right away, you have the opportunity to drop below into a deeper portion of the cave that serves as a tutorial area, somewhat reminiscent of Things Betwixt from DS2. It looked like a long way down, but I assumed this was Miyazaki's way of showing me, hey, you can do this now and you won't die. So I took the leap of faith and was surprised upon hitting the ground to see that I still took a sizable amount of fall damage, which felt inconsistent to the damage I did or did not take in other parts of the game world. So yeah, there are some inconsistencies with fall damage that I hope are fine-tuned by February. Nothing game-breaking, it's just occasionally annoying in a game whose traversal I know Miyazaki has said should be stress-free. Takeaway number 4. In Elden Ring, you're encouraged to actively weapon swap during combat and have 6 available slots for doing so. And I've discussed this before, but we're not talking about Doom Eternal levels of weapon swapping here. This isn't PB Rocket Ballista Super Shotgun territory. But without being too heavy-handed about it, you can tell FromSoft wants us as players to experiment with different weapon combos, to maybe even rely on a main weapon or two, but to keep a third or fourth weapon ready to go at a moment's notice, particularly if they make use of interesting weapon skills that can be unleashed strategically during combat. This also leads us to the topic of equipment load, or how many items, or heavy items specifically, you can have actively equipped relative to your strength attribute before your movement speed noticeably slows. In Elden Ring, there are 4 weight states from what I could tell: light, medium, heavy, and overburdened. And as long as my equipped items did not exceed 70% of my total allowed weight, I would avoid a slow state, which means fat rolling, slower back steps, fewer iframes, and higher stamina costs. And if I did not exceed 30% of my total allowed weight, I would achieve the lightest, fastest state possible in the game, which, in my opinion, feels extremely fast. The roll speed is insane. But because I wanted to experiment as much as possible and have multiple weapons equipped at any given time, I spent most of my playthrough in that medium equip load state, so between 30% and 70% of my total allowed weight. And I do think this medium state is is Elden Ring's sweet spot. It allows you to play the game, I believe, in an ideal way that Miyazaki intended. I also feel this incentivizes players who may not have previously prioritized the strength attribute to do so while playing Elden Ring. But the appeal of weapon swapping, I feel, adds new significance to the strength attribute. In Elden Ring, you won't only level strength because you want to wield some awesome and obnoxiously huge hammer or greatsword. You'll do it because you value weapon variety, and that's cool. Takeaway number 5. There's a revised system for switching between one-handing and two-handing, and I like it and think it's clever and intuitive. But it does take a minute to learn and memorize. And for like the first hour of my playthrough, I had no idea how to two-hand weapons. I was mashing every button combination until I finally figured it out. But on the PS5 DualSense controller, triangle is the new action button because X is now the jump button. So in order to switch between one-handing and two-handing, you select which weapon you want with the D-pad, but then you hold triangle. And while holding triangle, tapping R1 will two-hand your right weapon and L2 will two-hand your left weapon. And when you let off triangle, R1 and L1 revert back to their typical attack functions. So again, this takes a second to learn, but the more hours I spent with a network test, the more I really came to enjoy and appreciate this system. It works a little differently when you're on horseback as well, but once you learn the controls, I feel it makes a lot of sense. It clearly encourages weapon swapping, as I discussed earlier, and it also encourages odd and interesting combinations of weapons. Again, to me, this feels rooted in DS2's power stancing system. You can definitely see how FromSoft went back, reflected on that system, and implemented something new in Elden Ring that suits this game. And I'm a big fan. I've talked about this before in my FromSoft videos, but I grew up playing fighting games like Mortal Kombat, and to this day, appreciate when a game engages me on a controller input level. Sure, there's lots of fantastic games out there that require relatively simple, even repetitive inputs, and there's nothing wrong with that. But one thing I love about a game like Bloodborne is transforming attacks, not just because they're cool and an efficient way to deal extra damage in battle, but because they keep your hands busy on the controller. Circle to dodge, and then an R1 into an L1, back to an R1, another dodge, and then a firearm parry, all while guiding your player character with the analog stick. Those are cool inputs in my opinion. Your fingers are covering a lot of ground on your controller, and I felt like Elden Ring definitely called to mind those busy moments from a game like Bloodborne. Swapping weapons, swapping between one-handing and two-handing, incorporating jumps and jump attacks, charged R2s, weapon skills, all while moving, guarding, rolling. We have so many moves and mechanics at our disposal in Elden Ring. My hands and fingers were always busy navigating the controller, executing a variety of inputs. In terms of feel, I love it. Takeaway number 6. The world is gorgeous and genuinely fun to explore. The single aspect of Elden Ring I have been most skeptical about has been its open world design. If you watch my channel, you know I dislike most of today's open world games. I find them to be dull, aimless fetch quest fests. But even for an open world curmudgeon like myself, Elden Ring is a blast. And it's for several reasons, one being the art direction. Elden Ring has a brighter, bolder color palette than any previous FromSoft game. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a dark fantasy game, and it has no shortage of dark, dank, creepy locations. But I love the look of Limgrave, which I believe, based on what we've been told, it's just one of 6 main regions that comprise the lands between. I'm assuming across the 6 areas there will be plenty of overlap and consistency in terms of art direction, but that we will venture into places very different than Limgrave as well. But man, just this chunk of the map, I could hang out here for 100 hours, 200 hours. It feels very FromSoft-esque, it certainly does, but I sense a lot of Legend of Zelda and Shadow of the Colossus influence in this game world as well. I do. And there's so much variety: beaches, caves, mines, castles, fields, bridges, canyons. I specifically hoped there would be some strong Hyde's Tower of Flame vibes in the lands between based on how much water we've come to realize is in this game world, and Oh man, let me tell you, this is Hyde's Tower of Flame on steroids. It's so cool. In the music, Yuka Kitamura's soundtrack, everything I heard in the game was superb, simply superb, even better than I imagined. From the boss music to occasional ambient pieces that play in dungeons, the open field music that already feels classic. It gave me goosebumps every successive time I booted up the network test. I'm already nostalgic for it, longing for more time in Limgrave, more time in the lands between. And don't worry, if you don't want ambient music, you just turn it down in the settings. And Stormveil Castle is absolutely sensational. We don't get access to the entire castle. Portions of the castle we saw in From Software's November 4th gameplay showcase were actually gated off in the network test, but the areas of this castle or legacy dungeon that were available to me, oh, I just devoured them. As I previously said, this area feels very inspired by Boletarian Palace from Demon's Souls. Levels 1-1, the Gates of Boletaria, and 1-3, Inner Wards specifically. It's reminiscent of DS3's High Wall too, battling your way up staircases, negotiating mobs of strategically placed enemies. There's airborne enemies, there's melee enemies, there's ranged enemies, there's mini-bosses, there's environmental hazards. I know some recency bias is probably at play here, but being as objective as I can possibly be, Stormveil Castle feels as classic as any major area or dungeon we've ever seen. And my hope was that the big legacy dungeons would feel like playgrounds, Ashina Castle style. The approach and build-up, the verticality, interior sections, exterior sections, smart enemy placement, the use of space, lots of opportunities for exploration and backtracking. I am just obsessed with this place. The flapping banners, the circling birds overhead, the hand-painted storm clouds are rolling in. This area represents everything I love about FromSoft games, and I cannot wait to go back and see the whole dungeon come February 25th. It's also worth noting that one of my favorite enemy or boss encounters in the entire network test took place here, the Lion Guardian. This guy feels like an updated and revamped version of DS1 Sanctuary Guardian, but with a Bloodborne-esque twist. He's ferocious, he's fast, and he's entirely optional. Takeaway number 7. Elden Ring's lore seems deep, fresh, and intriguing. Now, this isn't a lore speculation channel. I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty here, the item descriptions, the NPC dialogue. If you love FromSoft lore like I do, just know an exciting new world is definitely waiting for you. This isn't Dark Souls. This is a noticeably different universe with different history and characters. And I couldn't eat it up fast enough. I think I read every single item description in the entire network test. I even went out of my way at the end of the network test to turn chaotic and kill every single NPC I could, just to push the game and to see what happened. And they had very interesting last words, I'll leave it at that. But the mystery, the tragedy, it's all there. You can tell that we're going to see and experience so much, yet lots of details, as always, will be left to our imaginations, to our interpretations. I will highlight 2 memorable NPC encounters because they were just so good. You meet your first NPC in the network test just after stepping out of the Fringe Folk hero's grave, just after you have your socks knocked off by the sprawling, colorful beauty that is Limgrave. You meet white-faced Vare, and his dialogue is amazing and even feels somewhat meta. It's Miyazaki's way of speaking directly to the player, his way of saying, "Welcome back, folks, buckle up." Vare is so condescending. The voice actor kills it. His lines are so great. The bit about feel free to go off and die in a ditch somewhere, and if you keep bugging him, he says, "Shouldn't you be off proving yourself or some such?" The other encounter that left a very strong impression was Sorceress Selen. I randomly stumbled upon these ruins called the Post Town Remains and encountered this wild poison flower mini-boss. After dispatching it and its adds, I noticed there was a blocked off stairwell nearby, heading underground. So with a little experimental platforming, I managed to get down there and met the one and only Pumpkinhead. This optional boss takes his name from the pumpkin helm on his head, which you get as a reward for defeating him, and whose item description is legendary. But if that wasn't enough, at the back of Pumpkinhead's chamber is a door, and beyond that door is Sorceress Selene, who wears this crazy oversized mask and teaches you some amazing new spells. Interestingly, she is one of the only NPCs I encountered but could not kill. The network test didn't allow it for some reason. I am eager to learn more about her come February 25th. And again, I just described one random 20-minute section of Limgrave. Stumbling into some ruins, fighting a mini-boss, platforming your way into a hidden cellar where you fight a proper boss who drops an awesome helm and allows you to access a merchant NPC. That's just one little optional sliver in the network test. I mean, that's Elden Ring in a nutshell, and it's awesome. Takeaway number 8. Elden Ring's game world is full of water, but swimming does not appear to be an option. This was one of the first things I tried in the network test. I walked over to this cliffside and while checking out the ocean and beaches below, spotted this nearby island. So my instinct was to find my way down there and attempt to swim across. And I quickly realized the ocean is a bottomless death pit, which initially disappointed me. It reminded me of fighting the Hydra in Darkroot Garden in DS1 and slipping off that lake edge, as we've all done at some point or another, and dying. But then later during my network test playthrough, I stumbled into some caves, battled my way through, and before I knew it, I was emerging above ground on that island I had spotted earlier. And there were some cool rewards on that island too. So then I began to appreciate the design of this world a little more. Like, okay, if I could have just swam over here Sekiro style, these rewards, well, they would not have been rewards at all. They would have been spoon-fed to me. So I like the idea that you can spot a point of interest off in the distance, but not know how to reach it right away. That's interesting. That's clever design. But I am hung up a bit on this idea of the ocean being a bottomless death pit. It's not a deal breaker, not at all, but it might be cool if some form of water traversal becomes available later in the game. I think this is my biggest question moving forward, especially because the Erd Tree appears to be jutting out of the ocean. It almost appears to be out in the middle of the water. And I know people have speculated that perhaps the map itself is a ring, that the land resembles a ring around the tree, which is in the center. I could definitely see that, but I strongly suspect that Miyazaki is only showing us one card in his hand, so to speak. Other than a few select screenshots, just about every part of this game that has been revealed or showcased to date is from Limgrave, this first region that was accessible in the network test. I think back to Bloodborne, those early trailers. They in no way indicated what we were truly in store for. You can appreciate just how much From Software was withholding. The game looked sick, sure, but it basically looked like torches and pitchforks in a twisted Charles Dickens-esque world. You don't get the Lovecraft influence, the cosmic horror. You can't fathom stuff like fighting Amygdala in the Nightmare Frontier. So that's where my mind goes right now with Elden Ring. I bet there's so much more to Elden Ring than what meets the eye right now. And perhaps some form of unlockable water traversal is one of those things. Maybe if we had that ability right off the bat, maybe it would break the game. Shout out to my man Leland, aka Shiny Chirim, who told me he hopes we can strap some barrels to Torrent and turn him into a makeshift pontoon boat. That gave me a good laugh, but it also sounds awesome. I'd be down. Takeaway number 9. The game as is does have some technical issues. Nothing in my opinion that's devastating or ruins the experience of playing the game, but things I do hope are polished and improved in the coming months. Now, I played on PS5, and the game offers two options. The option to prioritize a 4K resolution with an unlocked frame rate, or the option to prioritize 60 frames per second at a resolution that hovers somewhere between 1500p and 1800p. And I have a couple gripes with both modes. In the quality mode that targets a 4K resolution, the higher pixel count is appreciated, the image is sharp, and you can really enjoy the fine details on armor sets and such. But the frame rate appears to be unlocked, kind of bouncing all over the place. It's definitely not a locked 30 FPS, but I actually wish it were, and it seems that it easily could be. The inconsistency is what bothered me, so I hope they just lock the game at 30 FPS when using this option. And then my preferred way of playing is the performance mode, which favors 60 frames per second, but the game does struggle to maintain 60 FPS. I didn't mind the occasional dips into the 50s too much. I feel like the game is often hovering between 50 and 60 FPS, which is not the biggest deal in the world, but there are clear occasional dips into the 40s, and I feel that's inadequate. The dynamic resolution scaling should be further tweaked. It doesn't surprise me that a game this big and this dynamic is struggling to hit like 60 FPS at 1800p. That might just be unrealistic. I'd be cool with 1440p as long as it was locked to 60 FPS as much as possible. I mean, I once joked that I would play Elden Ring in 720p if it meant I could get 120 FPS, so I'm cool with giving up some pixels so that combat is always smooth and always fluid. But the single technical issue that bugged me the most was pop-in. This game, as is, does have some LOD pop-in issues. It was especially noticeable while riding Torrent across the map. I could literally watch grass populate into the field in front of me. Sometimes it was more glaring than other times. In my mind, these hiccups just break my immersion with an otherwise incredible game. This is the main thing I hope From Software improves before February. FromSoft has always prioritized interesting, fleshed out art direction and aesthetics over pure visual fidelity. And remember, this is not technically a next-gen game. Elden Ring is rooted in that last-gen software and hardware, so I don't expect it to surpass what Bluepoint did with Demon's Souls, but I just want a bit more stability because the game world is so breathtakingly beautiful. I don't want any technical hiccups getting in my way of appreciating that world that FromSoft clearly worked so hard to design. Takeaway number 10. This has been one of the biggest questions surrounding Elden Ring. Is that signature From Software difficulty intact? I can tell you, yes, it is. The bosses and mini-bosses bring it. Dragon Agheel roasted me a good 5 to 6 times before I figured him out. The Tree Sentinel crushed me a good 5 to 6 times before I figured him out. Margit, the one mandatory boss in the network test, he crushed me tons of times. And look, there's probably going to be at least one troll in the comments who's like, Margit was easy. I beat him my first time blindfolded with both hands tied behind my back, only using my toes. Look, if that's your experience, good for you. But coming from somebody who's been playing and speedrunning these games for years, Margit is legit. If you fight Margit solo, without a shield, without being over-leveled, you are in for a challenge. I can't be definitive at this point in time, but he may be the hardest first mandatory boss in any From Software game. He's so cleverly designed, as I mentioned earlier. His AI is clearly intended to punish old habits from even experienced players. I spent quite a bit of time learning Margit and fighting him as a base level bloody wolf, and yeah, he can pretty much one or two shot you if you make just a single mistake. And summoning is way easier than it was before. They've baked summoning into the game on a more fundamental level, but for that reason I feel like in Elden Ring, maybe more than ever before, players will distinguish between, oh, did you solo that boss or co-op that boss? Because Margit is infinitely easier with help, but without help, he's gotta be one of the best bosses we've ever seen from FromSoft. His AI is like Frida Gale level, yet he's an early game boss. It also feels like they're taking the DS2 approach with Elden Ring in terms of just throwing a ton of bosses at us, but of course they're much higher quality bosses than many of those in DS2. I counted like 10 main bosses in the network test and almost just as many mini bosses. I suppose it depends on your definition of mini boss, but they were so much fun. Other than Margit, Grave Warden was probably my favorite fight. The Bloodhound Knight was sick. Dragon Agheel was sick. The Burial Tree Watchdog was a total WTF moment. Like, what is this? What is he doing? Why is he moving like that? I had so much fun fighting these bosses, and you just never knew who or what you were going to come across next. Takeaway 11. In my opinion, Elden Ring PvP is somewhat annoying and lacking, specifically in terms of co-op summoning. So I really wanted to see what co-op was like and repeatedly tried to summon other players for the Agheel dragon battle. But like clockwork, every time the other players were summoned, we were instantly invaded. So often we'd be trying to fight Agheel, but some roll spammer would be trolling around and casting spells at us and just ruin the whole experience. And there was no way to prevent this. So I just gave up and finished off Agheel solo. In my mind, if FromSoft is going to restrict invasions to co-op play, it should feel a little more nuanced than this. Or perhaps they could even give us an item that blocks invasions for a period of time if you and a friend strictly want to fight field bosses or enemy mobs. I understand that could affect the randomness or unpredictability of invasions, but as is, I wasn't loving the experience. I was primarily invaded by roll spammers who would quit out whenever their HP got low, so I don't know. I hope in the final game PvP feels a little better than this, but we'll see. Takeaway number 12. Guard countering is indeed cool, but I'm still wrapping my head around the mechanics. So if you're using a shield, it's a little more straightforward. But I think it's just cooler to not use a shield and guard and counter with a melee weapon, but that seems to guarantee a certain amount of chip damage, which varies depending on your weapon, your stamina, and the power of the oncoming attack. But the trade-off is that your counterattack is super powerful, so you accept a little chip damage in exchange for dealing some big damage yourself. And especially because dispatching certain enemies or enemy mobs will grant you an additional swig of your flask of Crimson Tears, basically this game's Estus flask, that chip damage is often inconsequential, but I still hesitate to accept damage, even a little chip damage, in any situation, particularly when I can parry and riposte, when I can roll and strafe and jump. So guard countering is definitely awesome, but strategically I'm still mulling it over of how valuable I think it is, of when I'd most want to use it. Even though I had 15 hours with the game, that just wasn't enough time to fully make up my mind about this kind of stuff. And takeaway 13, which will be my final takeaway of this video, the new Ashes of War system is both simple and complex at the same time. So Ashes of War basically combines scaling and weapon skills, and this is all interchangeable and reversible at any site of grace, which is Elden Ring's version of bonfires. So if you apply a certain Ashes of War with a certain weapon, you'll unlock that Ash's unique skill, which you can then perform with that weapon. But you also get the option when applying Ashes to a weapon to choose an affinity, which affects the weapon's scaling. So Keen Ashes of War increase dexterity scaling, but decrease strength scaling and base damage. Whereas Quality Ashes of War balance strength and dexterity scaling, but decrease base damage. And Magic Ashes of War add magic damage and intelligence scaling, but reduce strength and dex scaling, as well as base damage. So it's up to you to determine what kind of character you want to play as, to level up accordingly, and then strategically select ashes that best fit your playstyle and weapon of choice. So it is a lot to consider, but you can also ignore all of this and not choose an affinity which will respect a weapon's original scaling, but you can still make use of that ashes skill. So maybe you want to use the Piercing Fang skill, but you don't want to tamper with scaling. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can really optimize your loadout. So it's an interesting system. I've heard some people argue that FromSoft has made scaling and access to weapon skills more complicated than these things need to be, and I've also heard other people say the opposite, that this system is smart and easy to dive into. I think every player is going to have to make that determination for themselves. I mostly enjoyed experimenting with Ashes of War, and the skills themselves, oh my god, they are so awesome. They're so good. And I found myself using them all the time. They didn't feel like cheap add-ons. They felt like meaningful and powerful attacks that I could only benefit from incorporating into my arsenal. But much like guard countering, even 15 hours isn't that much time to wrap your head around a new system like this, so I'm eager to dive deeper come February. And there you have my 13 biggest takeaways from my time with the Elden Ring network test. A few complaints, sure, no game is perfect, not even a From Software game, especially a pre-release version of a From Software game. But overall, Elden Ring is sick. It's all I'm going to want to play in 2022. If you're a Miyazaki fan through and through like myself, you're in for such a treat. The network test entirely exceeded my expectations, which were already very high, based on the bar Miyazaki himself has set over the years. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts about my takeaways, or if you have any direct questions for me about my time with the test, I'd be happy to try to answer those in the comments. And if you had an opportunity yourself to take the network test for a spin, what aspects of the game left the biggest impressions on you? Head down to the comments and let me know. Of course, you can also connect with me on Twitter, Instagram, on my Discord server, Terrapop's Treehouse, and on Patreon, where, like I said, I will be sharing a second exclusive video only for my patrons in which I discuss even more takeaways from the network test. So thank you for watching, be well, take care, and I will catch you next time.